It's April 14th, 1912, 11:30 p.m. You're standing on the deck of Titanic. The night is perfect, too perfect. The sky is so clear and the stars are so bright that you can read your watch outside. Veteran sailors would note how unusually calm the sea was, like glass. Perfect visibility stretching for miles in every direction. In the crow's nest, an experienced lookout has been scanning the horizon for hours. He sees nothing, but something is wrong with the air itself. The horizon looks strange. There's a haze where there shouldn't be one. Then at 11:40 p.m., a dark mass suddenly appears out of nowhere. 37 seconds. That is all the warning they get. 10 seconds of grinding metal against ice. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the largest, most advanced ship ever built is gone, and more than 1,500 people are now dead. But if the conditions were so clear that night, how come the lookouts didn't see an iceberg that they should have been able to easily spot from miles away? For over a century, nobody could explain this. We blamed Captain Smith for going too fast. We blamed the Californian for not responding to distress signals. We blamed White Star Line for not having enough lifeboats. We thought we knew why Titanic sank, but we were wrong. Tim Maltin, digging through 1912 weather records, found something nobody had looked for. And in 2022, 2 robots spent 6 weeks scanning every inch of the wreck, giving us, for the first time, the complete crime scene. Together, these 2 discoveries don't just add to the Titanic story, they rewrite it. The only eyewitness left who knows what actually happened, who has been lying 12,500 feet below the surface, silent and deteriorating, is finally able to tell her story. The answer isn't human error, it's physics, and it was invisible.
Was so clear, and the thermal inversion meant that it was literally so clear that there was a haze caused by the clarity.
This is Titanic beneath the surface. To understand what happened on April 14th, 1912, we need to go back almost 1 year earlier to May 31st, 1911. We're at the Harland & Wolff shipping yard in Belfast, the absolute heart of the world's shipping industry. JP Morgan, the wealthy American investment banker, has come to see his latest investment, the Titanic, the result of a $32 million gamble, roughly $1.1 billion today. She represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering, nearly 900 feet long, 200 feet tall, with a rudder the size of a 7-story building. It's the largest movable object ever created, and today, she's about to move for the very first time. To the shipwrights who built her, she's known as SS-401. To everyone else, she's the Titanic. The celebratory launch wasn't marked with a good luck tradition of smashing champagne bottles. White Star Line, the owners of Titanic, didn't believe in such superstitions like bad luck. But unbeknownst to its owners or its VIP investors, the very first Titanic death happened before the ship even left the dock, perhaps setting the tone of her maiden voyage before it had even begun. James Dobbin, one of the workers that day, was crushed beneath a heavy wooden support that was holding Titanic upright. Despite his colleagues' best efforts, Dobbin died in hospital 2 days later, but that was just the first death of many to come. There really was no incentive to cut corners, and that showed in every innovation built into Titanic's design. She had a double hull, transverse watertight bulkheads that could be sealed at the press of a button. She was designed to survive a direct head-on collision. The engineers ran every scenario, and they built a ship that could stay afloat even if her first 4 compartments completely flooded. 4 compartments. Remember this. That number is going to matter later. But by far the biggest advancement in shipping technology was the Marconi wireless. Now ships no longer had to be within eyesight of another ship to get help. They could wirelessly transmit messages up to 400 miles. And unlike most ships that carry just one operator, Titanic had the luxury of two. But to understand why Titanic was built this way, you have to understand what happened just a decade earlier off the coast of British Columbia. Lifeboats at the time were considered a last resort rescue plan, and for good reason. Just a decade before Titanic, the Clallam steamship sank off the coast of British Columbia, and the crew did what seemed like the heroic thing. They lowered all the women and children into the ship's 3 lifeboats. Every single one of them died in the open ocean. That disaster changed everything. The new philosophy became make the ship so safe that you don't even need lifeboats. And Titanic was the living proof of that idea.
To say that a ship was unsinkable, which is what the whole world was saying, to say that was flying in the face of God.
But that philosophy, as we'll see, would cost lives. Even her captain, Edward Smith, was one of the most experienced and respected in the entire White Star Line fleet. Known as the millionaire's captain for the wealthy passengers who requested him by name. This voyage on Titanic was set to be his last before retirement. A man who had crossed the Atlantic over 100 times without incident. A man who had absolutely no reason to think this voyage would be any different. When we think of Titanic, we think of everything that went wrong at sea, but the chain of events that doomed her started months before she even left port. And each link in that chain was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that nobody could have predicted where it was leading. One of those incidents happened a few days before Titanic's departure. As Titanic prepared for her maiden voyage, Captain Smith made last-minute crew changes. Second Officer David Blair was replaced by Charles Lightoller. In the chaos of the shuffle, Blair accidentally left the ship with something in his pocket, the key to the crow's nest storage locker, the locker that contained the lookout binoculars. The crew didn't realize this until they were already at sea. Frederick Fleet testified that with binoculars, he might have seen the iceberg sooner. He believed that. The Inquiry believed that. For over a century, we believed that. But here's what nobody knew then, and what changes everything about that testimony. The iceberg wasn't hidden by darkness. It was hidden by physics, and no pair of binoculars would have helped. We'll come back to that. And the errors continued to pile up during the voyage as well. For the first 3 days, the voyage was flawless. Passengers were stunned by the luxury, the grand staircase, the first-class dining saloon seating 500 people, the indoor swimming pool, the first of its kind at sea. And part of that luxury was a Marconi wireless. As I mentioned, Titanic had 2 Marconi operators on board, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. But here's the critical detail most people miss. They didn't work for White Star Line. They worked for Marconi. So their primary job wasn't relaying weather warnings to the bridge. It was transmitting personal messages for passengers. The day before the sinking, the Marconi machine broke down due to a short circuit. Now, Marconi company protocol says to set the machine aside and wait for a replacement at the next port. Instead, Phillips and Bride spent 7 hours fixing it themselves. That single decision saved 705 lives. Neither man knew it yet. On Sunday, April 14th alone, Titanic received 7 separate ice warnings. 7. One of them came at 7:30 p.m. The Californian reported 3 large bergs directly in Titanic's path. Phillips filed it under a paperweight. He'd get to it later. Captain Smith did see several of the ice warnings, but he wasn't particularly worried. Ships encountered ice in the North Atlantic all the time in April. In clear weather like they were experiencing, you could spot icebergs miles away with plenty of time to navigate around them. He had no reason to think tonight would be any different. But with 7 iceberg warnings in one day, why was Titanic still traveling at nearly full speed? Here's what most people don't understand. Shipping protocols at the time actually dictated that you maintain speed or go faster through ice fields to get through the danger zone as quickly as possible. But there's another factor. Speed wasn't just controlled by the captain, it was controlled by the passengers. Every day, a bulletin was posted on sea deck near the grand staircase showing how far Titanic had traveled in the past 24 hours. It was a thrilling part of the day where passengers would gamble on the ship's daily distance and was a main topic of conversation. This is where one of the most controversial claims about Titanic enters the story. On board Titanic was J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line. First-class passenger Elizabeth Lyons would later report overhearing a conversation between Ismay and Captain Smith where Ismay allegedly said, quote, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday," end quote, which is a full day ahead of schedule. Historians are split on whether this conversation ever happened. Some find it unlikely because docking at night without press coverage made absolutely no sense for two men who loved the limelight. Others believe they were absolutely determined to beat Olympics time and that arriving early would generate massive headlines. What we know for certain is that on April 14th, Titanic was traveling at 22 knots, 5% faster than the day before in an ice field. Whether ambition drove that decision or protocol, it didn't matter because the danger ahead wasn't something speed could outrun. It was something the lookouts couldn't see at all. As the sun set, passengers cleared the deck in search of warmth and food indoors. In second class, passengers were singing hymns since it was Sunday after all. In an eerie twist, one of the hymns sung that night was for those in peril on the sea. To think that in just a few hours, that hymn would become a reality. Meanwhile, in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet was staring into a darkness that didn't look right. The horizon had a haze that shouldn't have been there, and the sea was unnaturally calm, which was actually a problem. Wind normally creates small ripples around the base of icebergs that give them away. Tonight there was nothing, and without binoculars, they were searching with just their eyes. But there is another way to sense icebergs: by their smell. Icebergs give off this distinctive mineral scent as ancient glacial ice slowly melts, and Fleet had been smelling it for over an hour, which meant they were surrounded by icebergs. Later estimates suggest there were about 200 icebergs in the area that night, but Fleet couldn't see a single one, and he was about to find out why. Then at 11:10 p.m., the Californian sends another message reporting that they have stopped for the night. They've been blocked in by an impassable ice field. The message was so loud it nearly blasted Philip's ears. California was now close and in range, probably within 10 miles. Phillips, frustrated and exhausted, tapped back KAOM, "Keep out, old man." 20 minutes later, California's operator, Cyril Evans, shut down his equipment for the night and went to bed. He had no idea what was about to happen just over the horizon. Tonight, something was off. There was no contrast. It was like trying to see a black cat in a dark room. But then, Fleet saw something. Not an iceberg at first, just a dark mass. A blank patch that looked slightly different from the rest of the darkness, growing larger and larger with every passing second. Then he saw it. 3 strikes of the bell, the signal for an object dead ahead. He grabbed the telephone to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch picked up immediately. "Iceberg right ahead." Murdoch had maybe 37 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether 2,224 people lived or died. Murdoch ordered hard to port, swinging the bow left to try to clear the iceberg's side, and it worked. At first, it looked like Murdoch's bold plan was successful. And on the surface, it was. But there was an ice shelf just below the water jutting out that, of course, Murdoch could not see. 10 seconds of grinding metal against ice. Titanic had struck the iceberg. A strange vibration ran through the ship, not a violent impact, almost gentle. In third class, someone joked they must have arrived in New York early. People laughed and went back to their party. In the first class lounge, champagne glasses barely trembled. It didn't feel like anything had gone wrong. Thomas Andrews, Titanic's designer, was woken and brought below by Captain Smith to inspect the damage. What he found was catastrophic in the quietest, most mathematical way possible. Andrews counted 5 breached compartments. But remember, Titanic was designed to only survive 4. 5 compartments meant the ship would tilt forward like a row of ice cubes in a tray, spilling water from one compartment to the next in an unstoppable cascade. Andrews told Captain Smith, "We have an hour, maybe 2 at most." Smith asked, "You're certain?" Andrews nodded. "It's a mathematical certainty. This ship is going to sink by a margin of 1 compartment, just 12 feet of hull. The most advanced ship ever built was going to sink." At 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith ordered Phillips and Bride to send the call for assistance. In other words, send a CQD, shorthand for come quickly distress. But the ship didn't feel like she was sinking. The lights were still on. The engines were still running. Everything seemed almost normal. Harold Bride, the younger operator, tried to cut the tension. "Send SOS, it's the new call, and it might be your last chance to send it." Their messages spread out across hundreds of miles of ocean. Unfortunately, most wireless operators had already gone to bed. It was after midnight, and there was no 24-hour radio watch yet. But one man was still awake. Harold Cottam on the Carpathia had been on duty since 7 a.m. He was about to shut down for the night when he decided to do one last good deed: pass along some waiting messages to Titanic. The reply that came back made Cottam's blood run cold. "Come at once. We've struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man." The message ended with the last known coordinates of Titanic. Cottam raced to the bridge and woke Captain Arthur Rostron. Rostron immediately set course at full speed for Titanic. But Carpathia was 4 hours away, and Titanic only had 2. It was now an hour after hitting the iceberg. Passengers were slowly trickling out onto the deck with life vests. Titanic had developed a slight list or tilt, but it was barely noticeable. At this point, passengers weren't even aware Titanic was actively sinking. Some passengers were even playing with the ice from the iceberg that fell onto the deck. It truly didn't seem like anything was wrong.
My mother went out in the hall and asked the first cabin steward she saw, "What is the matter? Why have we stopped in the middle of the ocean?" And so he said, "No, there's nothing wrong at all. There's just had a little accident, and they're going to fix it, and we'll be going on in a few minutes."
Plus, this was Titanic. Remember what we said about ships being safer than lifeboats? Titanic was proof of that idea. Were you really saying that the unsinkable ship was now sinking? It was a ludicrous thought. And that mentality was shared amongst the crew as well. Second Officer Lightoller genuinely didn't think Titanic was in any real danger. They began lowering lifeboats more out of protocol than anything else. Ironically, their first lifeboat drill at sea was meant to be earlier that morning, but Captain Smith canceled in favor of a longer church service. However, the real problem wasn't the number of lifeboats, it was time. And that was the one resource they didn't have. Lowering a lifeboat required skill. It was a 2-person job that demanded slow, steady unison, because if one side lowered faster than the other, the entire boat would tip and dump everyone into the ocean. But Titanic's crew were on the back foot. They hadn't done any lifeboat drills in the open ocean. In fact, the one and only lifeboat drill to ever be conducted on Titanic was at dry dock on April 10th during its safety inspection. Captain Smith left the lowering of lifeboats to his 2 most senior officers, First Officer Murdoch and Second Officer Lightoller. He gave his officers one order: women and children first. These orders were vague on a good day, but with wind roaring and tensions high, it was a recipe for disaster. And as a result, Murdoch and Lightoller went to their respective sides of the ship with very different interpretations of these orders. Murdoch allowed men to board with the women and children. His reasoning was practical. It kept families together, encouraged more people to get into the boats, and made the entire process faster. Women who were terrified to leave their husbands were more likely to get into a lifeboat if their husbands could come with them. Lightoller interpreted the order as strictly women and children only, often separating 15, 16-year-old boys from their mothers on a sinking ship. Because at what age does a child become a man? In his mind, he was following orders precisely, but in practice, he was tearing families apart in their final moments.
2 officers came in and they said, well, it's time to get into the lifeboats now. So one officer took my brother, the other one took my sister, carried them, and my mother and I climbed an iron ladder to the top deck to get into the lifeboat.
Murdoch saved far more lives, but even his boats weren't full. Each lifeboat could hold 65 people, but many launched with only 30 or 40 because convincing passengers to get in was nearly impossible. If the lifeboats had been loaded more efficiently, potentially another 700 lives could have been saved. By the way, if you made it this far in the video, you might as well hit subscribe and turn notifications on. Even the architecture of the ship played a role in lives lost. Titanic's design completely separated third-class passengers from everyone else. Different sections of the ship had gates that were normally locked to prevent the classes from mingling. When the evacuation order filtered down to third class, most passengers had no idea how to even get to the deck. They needed stewards to first unlock the gates and then guide them through the maze. And there weren't enough stewards and everything was taking too much time. Furthermore, all evacuation instructions were given in English. Many third-class passengers didn't speak English and therefore didn't understand what was happening. Some stayed in their cabins waiting for instructions that never came. In a way, Titanic was a victim of its own success, because by 1 a.m., Titanic had taken on more than 15,000 tons of water, but you'd never know it. It was designed to sink well, and it really did. Just imagine, the ship is sinking, but the lights are still on. People were having drinks in the lounge. The band was playing. It wasn't immediately clear any emergency was happening. So to convince women and children to be lowered into a lifeboat 8 stories down into pitch black open ocean was a tall order. Staying on the ship seemed to be the safest place to be. Meanwhile, Second Officer Lightoller was drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperatures, desperately working to lower as many lifeboats as possible. Ultimately, they ran out of time before they ran out of lifeboats. But when rescue finally arrived, the only survivors were those in lifeboats, and that made lifeboats look really, really good. And that's all anyone ever remembered. But we now know the real reason those boats survived, and it had nothing to do with their number. It was the sea itself. That night, the North Atlantic was described as, quote, a sea of glass. Any other night, those overcrowded boats would have been death traps. By 2 a.m., the bow was completely underwater. The 4 massive funnels toppled one by one like dominoes, crashing into the ocean. Passengers scrambled toward the stern, the last part of the ship above water, clinging to railings and to each other. The sight from the lifeboats below was shocking as they saw the ship tilt so far forward that the stern's propellers rose up out of the water. Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest, refused a seat in a lifeboat. Instead, he stayed on deck, hearing confessions and praying with those who remained, while the Lebanese passengers venerated the final moments in their own way with a celebratory dance of Debunked, symbolizing unity, cultural pride, and resistance, holding hands in a circle as they dance together one last time. Meanwhile, the wealthiest passengers were discovering that none of that mattered. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, was denied entry into a lifeboat to accompany his pregnant wife. Astor stepped back and waved goodbye as his wife was lowered into the darkness. His body was recovered weeks later, identified by only his monogrammed clothing. J.J. Astor, worth over $100 billion in today's money, identified by his initials on a shirt. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet famously changed into their finest evening wear, and after assisting as many women and children into lifeboats, were last seen in first class drinking brandy and smoking cigars, stating, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." A noble death, but not a peaceful one. Where Titanic split in two was where the majority of the first-class cabins were located, where Astor and Guggenheim paid upwards of $30,000 in today's money for a luxury suite. When the ship split, the bow hit the ocean floor upright, while the stern corkscrewed down so violently into the sea floor that 25 feet of the hull was buried beneath the mud. At around 2:10 a.m., Captain Smith officially dismissed the crew. They had done their duty heroically, and it was now time to save themselves if they can. This entire time, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were frantically sending SOS messages to anyone who could hear them. The water was up to their knees. Though Captain Smith eventually relieved both operators, Phillips remained at his post, sending distress calls until the very end. Bride survived and never forgot his colleague's sacrifice. By 2:20 a.m., Titanic was gone, dragged to the bottom of the ocean. Now, more than 1,500 people were in the freezing Atlantic waters. That was when the screaming started. Survivors described it as the worst sound they had ever heard. Those in lifeboats were now faced with a decision. Many of the lifeboats weren't filled. Do they paddle back and try to save those in the water? They were terrified they would die if they turned back now. Others pointed out by the time they reached them, it would likely be too late. Sadly, they weren't wrong. The screaming lasted about 20 minutes, then silence.
I can still hear them jumping from the deck and screaming and yelling for help, and the boat finally went under the water. There was nothing left.
When rescue arrived at 4 a.m., they found 705 survivors and nothing else. No debris, no bodies.
So on the Carpathia, the women were all standing at the rail watching for their husbands to come in later boats. And they never came.
If there weren't survivors, it would be hard to believe that the world's largest ship had been there at all. But how did the most advanced ship ever built on the clearest night of the year, with some of the best sailors in the world on watch, not see a 200-foot iceberg until it was 37 seconds away? The answer to that has been hiding in the weather records from that night, and nobody thought to look until recently. The night of April 14th, 1912 wasn't a normal night. Titanic was sailing directly from the warm Gulf Stream into the frigid Labrador Current. The ocean surface temperature was freezing, -2 Celsius, but the air 200 feet above the ship was much warmer, around 6 degrees Celsius. That 10 to 15 degree temperature difference across just 200 feet of elevation created what's called a temperature inversion. And temperature inversions bend light. You know about a desert or hot road mirage where asphalt in the distance appears wet, creating this shimmering puddle-like reflection on the road. But there is no puddle on the ground. It's an optical illusion. It's light bending upward through hot air near the road, making you see a reflection of the sky where asphalt should be. What was happening over Titanic was the exact opposite. A superior mirage, where light bends downward, curving around the Earth instead of traveling in a straight line. In normal conditions, lookouts could see about 12 miles to the horizon. But that night, light was bending so dramatically, they could theoretically see 30, maybe even 40 miles. Sounds like a good thing, right? Here's a problem. When light bends like this, it makes the horizon appear higher in the sky than it actually is. And between where the true horizon should be and where this false horizon appears, there was this band of haze from scattered, distorted light where nothing has proper contrast anymore. Normally, a dark iceberg stands out sharply against the dark ocean and sky. But with that false raised horizon and the haze below it, a massive white iceberg just disappears. This is what Frederick Fleet was looking at. Not a dark iceberg against a dark sky, but a wall of distorted light where the horizon should have been. He had been trained to scan for the sharp black outline of ice against ocean, but that outline didn't exist anymore. The physics of the atmosphere had erased it. This wasn't a theory. Other ships in the area that night documented the exact same phenomenon in their logs. Quote, "Great refraction on horizon," along with descriptions of an unusual haze. These were experienced captains describing something they had never seen before, something they couldn't explain. Fleet saw the haze, he noted it, but he couldn't explain it. No one could.
All the lookouts say, well, there was a haze on the horizon. They say it didn't really affect their view ahead, but there was a haze. And there was one point where Lord Mersey almost cracks it. Well, if there was a haze, but it didn't affect your view, it must be some extraordinary atmospheric phenomenon.
But he knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what was wrong was the sky itself. But that's quite literally just the tip of the iceberg. The barometric pressure that night was 1,039 millibars, one of the highest ever recorded in the Northern Hemisphere. That extreme pressure created the crystal clear sky and glass calm sea. Those perfect conditions created the temperature inversion. The inversion bent the light. The bent light created the false horizon, and the false horizon hid the icebergs. The very conditions that made everyone feel safe were the conditions that killed them. And now, finally, we can answer the question Fleet asked himself for the rest of his life. Why didn't I see it sooner? He wasn't negligent or careless. He was looking into conditions where an iceberg was physically, atmospherically invisible until it wasn't. And that's exactly what happened. At 11:40 p.m., the iceberg suddenly appeared out of the haze at close range where the Mirage no longer camouflaged it, but not close enough to avoid. And the cold air Mirage also explains the Californian mystery completely. Captain Stanley Lord could see another ship in the distance. He could physically see her lights. So why did he respond when he saw her firing distress rockets? Because the same atmospheric conditions that hid the iceberg from Titanic were completely distorting Californian's view of Titanic. When you judge distance at sea, you see the horizon as your reference. A ship whose hull disappears below the horizon is far away. A ship sitting on the horizon appears close. The false raised horizon made Titanic appear to be sitting right on it. In other words, because of the cold air Mirage,
she seemed to be smaller because she seemed to be nearer. So she looked like a 400-foot ship 5 miles away, whereas actually she was an 800-foot ship 10 miles.
The distress rockets that should have burned bright looked weak and faint, traveling through 10 miles of distorted atmosphere instead of 5. Similarly, the Morse lamp signals were also unreadable. And Captain Lord checked the radio chart. The only ship in this area with wireless was Titanic, the largest ship in the world. This small vessel was definitely not Titanic. So Captain Lord made what seemed like a reasonable decision at the time. A small vessel appeared to be having some kind of minor trouble. He thought, I'm not risking my 50 crew and passengers by navigating blindly into an ice field at midnight. We'll investigate at dawn. But 2 hours and 20 minutes later, more than 1,500 lives would be taken by the sea. Now, according to the Board of Trade rulebook, if there is any doubt about a rocket's intended meaning, you must assume the rockets are distress signals and investigate. For over a century, Captain Stanley Lord was labeled a coward. The British inquiry destroyed his career and his reputation, concluding he had seen Titanic in distress and deliberately chosen to do nothing, condemning 1,500 people to their death. Tim Maltin's meteorological research doesn't exonerate Lord's failure to act, but it does explain it. Both ships could see each other. Both ships thought they understood what they were seeing. Both ships were catastrophically, fatally wrong. The cold air mirage theory answers the question of why Titanic sank, but questions still remained. How exactly did the ship break apart? What did the iceberg damage really look like? What happened in those final moments? Because everything we know is only from eyewitness testimony. For 73 years after the sinking, Titanic lay undiscovered at the bottom of the Atlantic. Then in 1985, oceanographer Bob Ballard found her, starting with a single boiler on the ocean floor, following the debris trail back to the wreck.
And there it was. The boiler was on the screen.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
And then someone looked at the clock in the command center and said, she sinks in 20 minutes. It was 2 a.m. She sank at 2:20. And that innocent comment just grounded us. And we realized, you have finally put the rest where these souls were lost.
But exploring Titanic from a submersible was like investigating a crime scene through a keyhole. 6-inch viewports, limited light. Researchers could only ever see fragments at a time. And the theories multiplied because nobody could see the complete picture. Then in 2022, deep sea mapping company Magellan changed that. 2 remotely operated vehicles captured over 700,000 images from every angle possible to create a digital twin of the famous ship. It's the largest underwater scanning project ever attempted, and the most accurate model of Titanic down to individual rivets.
There's that moment when it first comes into view, and that's a moment that's priceless. You can't recreate that again in yourself, your personal feelings.
And in 2025, we finally saw it. The complete Titanic as no human had ever seen her. Not the survivors, not the rescuers, not even the researchers who had been studying her for decades. The entire crime scene laid out for the first time.
Photogrammetry gets it all together. And for the first time, I was seeing the wreck like it really is. And I've never seen it like that before. I've only seen it a little bit myself in the submersible. But I could tell it was right. It was data-driven. Mm-hmm. It was no human interpretation. He took the human element out of it. So we are seeing it just by the data.
And what it revealed confirmed accounts that survivors claimed for over a century and showed us the true story of those final moments in forensic detail, starting with First Officer Murdoch. Since Titanic sank, there was a persistent rumor that Murdoch shot himself in the final moments, overwhelmed by guilt or fear. Murdoch was labeled a coward for this action, but Second Officer Lightoller always insisted that is not what happened. He maintained that he watched Murdoch be swept overboard while trying to launch a final lifeboat minutes before the ship went down, dying a hero's death.
We've accounted for all the lifeboat davits on the ship, and only one set, 2 arms, one arm is still on the ship, the other one's in the debris field, are the only ones in the retracted position.
This physical evidence, hidden for 114 years, may finally vindicate Murdoch's legacy as the hero Lightoller always claimed him to be. But the digital twin wasn't done, because buried in the wreck was evidence of a different kind of heroism. The boiler room evidence revealed something extraordinary with the engineering crew. 2 of the 4 massive boilers that powered Titanic show concave damage, indicating they were still pressurized. In other words, still running when the ship went down. A steam valve was also found frozen in the open position, proving steam was still flowing to the emergency generator. This explains why survivors reported the lights were still on even as the ship went down. That was thanks to the engineering team led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, who all stayed at their posts knowing with absolute certainty that they were going to die down there. The water was rising, the compartments were flooding, there was no way out for them. But they kept the boilers running to keep power flowing through the ship. They did this so the crew would have light to safely launch lifeboats, so Phillips and Bride could keep sending distress calls. They did it because it was their job and because other people's lives depended on it. Every single engineer on Titanic died. And because of their sacrifice, 705 people made it into lifeboats who might not have made it otherwise. And then there's the iceberg damage itself, which turned out to be the most shocking revelation of all because it was nothing like what anyone had imagined. According to Park Stephenson, who analyzed the Magellan scan directly, the damage is a series of small puncture marks, each roughly the size of a piece of paper, running along the starboard side like a zipper. Parks put it perfectly. When you see the damage done, you would have thought an enormous missile struck the Titanic and not an iceberg simply grazing it. It is that catastrophic. Just enough to breach 5 compartments instead of 4. Just enough. There are hundreds of moments in the story where one small difference could save 1,500 lives. The binoculars, the ice warnings, the lifeboat drills. We focus on those because our minds need a reason to latch onto. But the cold air mirage wasn't a mistake or negligence. It was physics, a specific, measurable, explainable atmospheric phenomenon that maritime navigation had never encountered at that scale before. At the end of the day, Titanic, a metaphor for human ingenuity, was taken down by the graze of a millions of years old iceberg here long before Titanic and will remain here long after she is gone. In the next episode, we're in Belfast, standing on the actual slipway where Titanic was built. We talked to Tim Maltin, who walks us through exactly how the cold air mirage formed, and Park Stephenson, naval officer, James Cameron's Titanic advisor, the man who helped Magellan analyze the wreck, tells us what Titanic is still hiding. It is a Titanic conversation that you absolutely do not want to miss. Make sure you're subscribed and turn notifications on because that episode drops next week.